All right, all is as it should be. So we're very happy to be here for today's discussion, thinking about trans, two-spirit, non-binary inclusion in the workplace. We recognize that on Trans Day of Visibility, there's a lot that we can talk about. And so today's conversation, we're going to be focusing specifically on the workplace context, but recognizing that we bring ourselves to the workplace. And that means that, and especially now for many folks who may be working in a hybrid environment or a remote environment, that you may also have a lot of overlap between your home and your workplace, your community and your workplace. And that's something that we're quite familiar with in our work. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about that. As Anna said, the way that today's session is set up is going to be kind of like a rotating spotlight where the four of us folks here from Challenge Accepted are going to have a chance to speak about a little bit of our individual experience. We'll introduce ourselves, and then we'll ask questions of one another in an attempt to create a conversational dynamic. We know each other, we like each other, we work with each other. So there's the added bonus of having some history. So we're going to try and unearth some things that are a little bit deeper in the conversation if we can, and pull on our own personal experiences so that we're not just giving sort of the most entry-level discussion to this. That said, it is a conversation that we're encouraging folks of all different identities to be a part of today. Our focus today was to make sure on Trans Day of Visibility that trans and non-binary identities were particularly highlighted in the discussion. And from our perspective, we're going to be talking about that a fair amount. But if you're someone who is in the conversation joining us today who identifies as cisgender, we encourage you to think about how you can play into some of the pieces that we're talking about, specifically in doing that work of allyship and doing that work of accomplishship and what that looks like in the workplace. So there's lots of opportunities to think about how you can plug into this work. And in fact, that work is open to everyone of every identity. So lots more to be said, but at this point, I'm going to zip it and turn it over to Ronnie, who's going to kind of set the stage for us.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, I'm Ronnie. I use they and them pronouns. So we wanted today, as Alex said, to feel as conversational as possible. And this topic can be very activating for various reasons for almost everybody in the room. So I want us to just encourage us to take a moment to be still and take a breath and imagine that we're all sitting in a cafe in person, having a casual conversation with friends. And if you feel comfortable at all, like acknowledging that this is being recorded, to share your video so we can see you, that would be really lovely. And so this is a challenge by choice. I respect if you don't want to share video, and it is a day of visibility. So maybe in the spirit of that, we can all be a little bit visible. Thank you for joining us today. Shall we get started?
Yeah, let's do it. Christine?
Welcome.
All right. Hi, everyone. So I will kick us off by saying hello. And unlike my pals, I'm actually coming into you from Treaty 11 in Yellowknife. Currently, I've been here for a month as a settler, as a visitor. So I just wanted to make note of that, and also welcome folks to put into the chat in case if you are tuning in from elsewhere outside of the GTA, Treaty 13 area, feel free to put that in there. So I will start off by introducing myself a little bit, and then my pals will then pose a couple questions for me to elaborate on my experiences. So hello, everyone. My name is Christine Sue. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns. I'll quickly socially locate. I am an immigrant settler. I moved to Toronto when I turned 9 from Taiwan. English is my second/third language. It kind of has changed over time, certainly because of my relationship to languages and having to you know, having grown up in Toronto, mostly in North York and a little bit of Scarborough, that's sort of my stance in terms of, or sorry, view and lens in terms of growing up and having attended University of Toronto in health and phys ed and did the Teachers College there. That's sort of how I began my educational sort of training in terms of how it led me into the work of anti-oppression and anti-racism work, and specifically in thinking about inclusion in sports. I grew up playing a lot of sports, and so you know, my relationship to my body and ability certainly changed over time as well. So as an immigrant settler, I am also somebody who moves through the world having had a lot of different concussions over time, and identifies, you know, being neurodivergent in that sense of how I process information, how I access spaces. I think a lot about ability and disability because of having experienced temporary disability from all of the different types of sports injuries I've had. And I also am somebody who is have had different relationships to my gender, and it changes over time. So the words I use to describe who I am as a queer and non-binary person is both queer and non-binary, gender fluid specifically, and I also continue to identify as a woman. And that specific piece around being a woman and womanhood is also tied very closely to my experience, both with my hair and to sports. So that's the specialty that I take up as a person who started coming out in undergrad as gay, thinking I was cisgender, and then throughout that time, really focusing in on queer and trans inclusion. And I had no idea really what my gender really meant for me, but I knew that it didn't really sort of felt like it fit. In terms of the cisgender womanhood I was thinking about and I self-identifying as. And until I met my pals here, that all of us are here with you, coming in with you today, I didn't really have the language to understand that I could be something outside of being cisgender. So it wasn't until my mid-20s, I was working in a queer organization alongside my pals that you see here today, that I was able to access the language and understanding and the exploration of gender and the conditions to have those conversations, that I was able to continue to really come out and be much more comfortable and also visible, both in a professional context and in an informal context around my pals, thinking through, you know, organizing a queer sports leagues. What does that look like, sound like, feel like? Thinking about policy work, thinking, you know, I am somebody who experienced a good time mostly in gym class and in sports, but I was often thinking about my pals who weren't having a good time, and how to make those spaces much safer for people to access sports. So I was able to test out my thinking through that, through the experience of organizing a flag football league, a queer flag football league in Toronto, and through that really seeing how people really came to life and was able to come out as trans and non-binary, and a couple folks transitioned in playing through having that experience in sports, and that was, of course, incredible to witness and also grow alongside. And from there, I essentially really expanded my career in sports inclusion, thinking about trans non-binary inclusion, doing a lot of work, policy work, advocacy work, as well as working as a movement coach, a personal trainer, specifically more so for queer and trans folks. I always say as a passion project, and would do it for free if I had all the time and energy. But certainly to be able to give back to folks and make sure that people just can access movements that feels good, and that it can hopefully be healing as opposed to a site of violence for folks. So outside of that, I did end up working in corporate at one point, wanting to take a break from having my professional queer hat on. And I was like, oh, I love training. I love adult education. Let's go into corporate learning. And I worked in a large corporate company in Canada, and was able to develop a huge Salesforce training program out of that experience. But unfortunately, my experience of being a non-binary person in that space was then highlighted in a negative light, in the sense of not being able to access safer washrooms in that space. So I had to think through having to take legal action eventually. I didn't end up doing so, but I had to do all of the research, the work, the connecting to people I knew to be able to say and decide whether or not taking the legal action was worth my energy and time. And it was unfortunately a very traumatic experience on that realm. From there, went into healthcare as well, working in-house, working alongside my pals in our group, taking on different projects. And also the healthcare setting was specifically in an EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion portfolio. So I was like, you know what, enough with the informal free labor I was doing. I'm going to put back on my professional queer hat and go into a hospital setting to work specifically with kids with disabilities, thinking about the rehab setting and trying to make those spaces safer for staff and the clients there. And then kind of came in and back out of the post-secondary setting as well as this as a student support staff working in gender-based violence support center type settings as well. So that's sort of my trajectory of the different types of work that I do. I move in and out of a lot of different spaces, making sure that I ground my work from the community space and up and connecting with folks. So I also, you know, in terms of social media, I keep a pretty public profile. I am also one of the administrators in Jobs for Queers for Ontario, nope, not Ontario, Toronto. And so that's sort of the lenses I can bring into the space here today and thinking about the career and workplace spaces, thinking about what it means to do this work professionally as a trans non-binary person, being visible in that space and context, as well as also thinking through those other spaces when these hats are not on professionally, but that you have to continue to do that work, and thinking about the types of boundary work and self-care that is required to be able to then take care of ourselves. So I'll stop it there for now, and I'll open the floor up to my pals to ask some questions.
Thanks so much, Christine, for sharing so much of this sort of how you find yourself in this space and the different sort of pieces that feed into that. I think you kind of summarized there, I think, the pieces that I was curious about at the end. I know this is something that we've talked about in different configurations as a group, but thinking about what it's like to put on formally, I guess, that role, or take on formally that role of doing EDI work as it so directly relates to different aspects of your identity, and what it's like to have to navigate that within a workplace environment where you are a person who is then also like a go-to or considered to be the professional voice for multiple communities, or a community in the very least. Is that something that you're comfortable sharing a little bit more about?
Yeah, sure. So it's my approach to EDI work has certainly shifted over time. And by shifted, I mean, I now have more boundaries, yay, boundary work. In terms of the relationship I have to doing this work as a person who is trying to thrive and survive at the same time, certainly experiencing transphobic violence from especially doing work in BIPOC communities certainly feels harder and different compared to being in a queer space that's, you know, mostly dominated by white folks. Oftentimes in corporate spaces, queer and trans inclusion is often dominated by white voices. And so especially in sports, I'm often the only non-binary person of color. And by often, I mean, I think I am one of the only people doing that work across Canada. And so that's definitely, you know, could be a very fraught relationship that I can have. And I often think about white supremacy and my relationship to that, and how codependent it can become because we're trapped in capitalism. So when I do certainly go to relational therapy. So I recommend, if you can have access to therapy spaces or healing spaces, conversations, to be able to unpack how much I rely on professional spaces where people are responding positively to what I'm sharing, and working on making sure that I have those tools to be able to self-validate and saying, I don't have to do this work to feel like my identities are valid, and making sure that I'm accessing joy, I'm accessing connections in my own communities, and be able to say no when even my own communities across the board, intersectional communities, when they start to ask me questions and say, how do I navigate this? Or I don't know about this. And I have to be able to say, actually, not today. I can't talk about that. It certainly, one thing that I often think about and talk about with pals is, and with folks, is that my body doesn't know when my body is in a professional space versus in a community space versus my own personal space. And so, you know, even in thinking through how trauma shows up in my body, I have to recognize where my boundaries are and work to not only cross them, but actually be able to not even get close to crossing them, and finding different ways to make sure that I'm not seeking healing or centering healing in my professional work. Because I think, having made a lot of mistakes back in the day, decades ago, I learned that, you know, I have to understand the parameters for myself to be able to care for myself. And putting on that professional hat is certainly quite difficult when it does hurt you. This work can be harmful because you're not just speaking for yourself, but you're speaking also for the people that may be harmed and don't have the leverage and the platform to speak to it. So that's something that I think about a lot as a professional, and that I have to model self-care as I do the work.
Thanks, Christine. Yeah, there's so much in there. Yeah, I'm just seeing some notes in the chat following up. But yeah, any folks on our team have a follow-up question that they want to share? Thoughts about that?
Yeah, as I was listening to you, I was just thinking about how you know, being the person who's being in a position of representing a collective voice that relates to your personal experience, how high the stakes are, and how you usually, after engaging like that, we're the ones left to carry the burden and the impact of that. And you're talking about self-care, and I know we talk about collective care a lot too, and relying on relationships and community to move through that. Yeah, that's just, I don't know, that's not a question, it's just maybe a prompt, perhaps.
Yeah, I for sure rely on community connections a lot. I'm somebody who literally graduated undergrad and was like, where are friends? I want more friends. Can we build community? Where are all the queer folks? And that really informed my way of doing my work, is creating those connections and relationships, in being able to then not only contribute to community and inclusion work to make sure that other folks don't have to go through as much harm as much as possible, but also looking at how that comes back to myself as well. And, you know, for the example that I shared around having to consider taking legal action, I was able to reach out to a lot of people that I connected with over time, and they were so generous to offer help and support when I couldn't, when I wasn't in the space of providing support, because they were able to say, you know, you were so generous with us working together. This is a reciprocal relationship. We want to help. And so that definitely was a really big piece that came up for me when I realized, oh, wow, yeah, like a lot of my work is also coming back, and that people are wanting to support one another. You know, I called the OHRC, the Ontario Human Rights Commission. I called the Canadian Human Rights Commission, because the company was a federal company. So I had to learn a lot along the way and also try not to be a workaholic and be like, what can I do to showcase this example in the future? For companies to know that it's when they fail to show up for their employees that it becomes a liability, not the employee, but the issue and the gap that they have. So that's where I'll pause for now. I'm sure I welcome folks, if you have questions about, especially going through the legal process, what that means, what it might take. I invite folks to poke me in the chat, private message if you'd like. If you have questions, I'm happy to support that as much as I can.
Thank you, Christine. Keeping things rolling. Ronnie, are you comfy jumping in and telling us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm Ronnie, I use they and them pronouns. I'm a registered psychotherapist and I work exclusively in queer and trans community. And I've been doing that work for about 10 years now. Where did this all begin? So I'll locate myself a bit as well. So I'm an immigrant settler to Turtle Island. I'm born and raised in Trinidad and Tobago. So shout out to all my Caribbean folks in the room, if there's any. And moved to Turtle Island in the 90s with my family. Growing up, I would definitely be that stereotypical kid wearing my mom's shoes, clicking around the house. And that was something that was received as something very cute in my family. And it was memorialized in picture books and albums, pictures of me dressing up femme. But as I got older, the socialization pressure of being raised and socialized as a boy started to become more important than some of the cute things that I did. It was seen as something cute and a phase, but not something that was real and authentic. And so I carry around this ghost feeling with me from when I was a little child that the most authentic parts about me are the worst. And so this double life of having something so deep and so precious and cherished as a small little child is now something that is like a mark on my being. So when I walk out into the world or when I move through the world, I feel like everybody sees this mark. In addition to all of that, I feel like I have multiple marks because it wasn't until I moved to Canada that I started to experience racism for the first time. So I moved through the world with this intersectional experience of oppression and marginalization. I'm an able-bodied person, and I have privilege when it comes to being educated and have access to the credentials that I've been able to acquire. I will say at this point, there's one or two other trans women of color who are psychotherapists in the country. We do not exist. We do not make it this far. We're not like there is very few folks in our community doing this work who share my identities. And so that is not something that is a moment of pride for me. That is a moment of what the hell is happening. The communities that are struggling the most are having the worst access to the care and support that they need because we are not allowing people to do this work, to get into programs. And obviously it's not just about admissions, but it's about, the whole system that is stacked against people to make it here. How did I make it here? Essentially, I did it not being trans. I moved through grad school and all of my placements and all of my training as a cisgender person. And I only came out after I started working in the field. So I don't credit the system for letting me through. I credit my ability to hide. coming out in the workplace, I'll just be really quickly. My work trajectory is somewhat more linear than Christine's, who's like, I'm like, whoa, you do a lot, honey. I'm really in the helping professional stream. So I started out with peer support in high school, and that moved into suicide prevention and intervention, and that evolved into counseling and psychotherapy. I've worked in crisis center, I've worked in a healthcare center, and now I work in private practice. I also teach psychotherapy at a relational psychotherapy school, and I am supervising people and helping train the next generation of radical therapists. Awesome stuff. But I will say that I was taught white psychology, cisgender psychology, and heterosexual psychology. I was not taught to be a therapist in my own community. And the industry of mental health was not set up to hold me and my identities and how I move through the world as a provider either. So I'm doing double learning. I'm learning how to work in my own community, triple learning. I'm learning about myself as I'm coming out and this newfound identity, this cherished place that I lost when I was a kid, coming back to that. And learning how to protect myself from all of the ways in which the system is telling me that I'm doing the work no good. And I need to do more, and I need to prove myself. And I can't do what my clients are asking me for. So definitely burnt out twice. Still kind of processing the burnout. But I'll leave you with this one question, which is that I struggle with. Can we give care and receive care at the same time? Can in my healing work with other people, can that heal me too? Because what I've experienced working in agencies that do not hold me is that my healing work isn't being shown to me by the people who employ me. And so that's why I work in private practice. So on this day of visibility, I want us to think about what we can learn from trans community and trans folks. And I think it is this piece around giving and receiving care at the same time. There's something really tender about how trans people come together to support each other that I think is so magical and beautiful, and we could all learn so much from it. And I'm obviously speaking about my pals here, but also other folks that I've met along the way. Would not be possible without the support of community. So I'll leave it there.
I'll jump in here with the question there, Ronnie. So you talked about being burnt in multiple times in workplaces, and I imagine, again, EDI hat, professional hat, informal hat on. I imagine there were a lot of committees that take place in a workplace. And so can you perhaps share an experience or example or how you choose to decide on which committees to join that are equity-based, that are identity-based, in order to, one, be more visible for your clients, and because you mentioned that the queer trans communities are often not served at large at all, and people are not equipped and prepared. So perhaps I'll focus in on that. You know, how do you make those decisions about joining in on those committees and the type of potential work that's demanded of you outside of your, your practice?
Yeah, I think the honest answer is that I did not. I did not decide. I joined every committee that I was asked to. Yeah, I joined the social committee, and one in particular was the trans health committee, where I sat with clients from the community, people in the team at the agency, And the committee fizzled out, and nothing came of it. That was really depressing to see and experience how this trans health committee got dropped. I think it did more harm to me actually than help, the change the system. And I would caution people to be very wary about joining committees that do not have a solid reference point for what it is you're actually trying to do, and exactly what kind of input you're going to be putting in. Because when it's vague and loose, then it's a perfect opportunity for overachievers and overdoers and people who would like to do extra work to take it all on. And actually, it's quite harmful. Anyway, good question. How do we feel about moving along?
Thanks, Ronnie. Feeling pretty good. I think a lot of the thrust of your discussion about, or that question that you finished, which is very much in line with, I know, some topics that Suki, you were keen to chat about.
Was that the ball being thrown to me? Happy to jump in if so. Hi, everyone. I'm Suki Bartle. I use to pronounce she, her, or they, them. Either is fine for me. Great to see everyone here today. So similar to my buddies, I'll start by just sharing a little bit about who I am as a person, and then I'll share a little bit about like my career trajectory, if you will. So I am a white settler. I've lived my entire life in so-called Canada / on Turtle Island. And I also am a queer, non-binary woman. Other language that I would use to describe my gender is genderqueer. And I also move through the world in a fat body and with multiple invisible disabilities. And certainly all of those aspects of who I am as a person impact the work that I do in the world. What does that work look like, you may ask? Well, lots of different ways. Similar to Christine, I have kind of been all over the place when it comes to my work life. So I started out my education thinking I would like to be an artist, and I certainly am, but that is a bit of a challenging career to move into. So my educational background is in both visual arts and cultural studies and critical theory. And from there, I went into kind of a space of like, what do I do with this? And so I ended up going to Teachers College because I've always been really passionate about education and found a lot of comfort in the space of kind of schooling, and always had a lot of admiration for my teachers. And so kind of between my undergrad and there, I spent a year teaching English in South Korea, and then came back, moved to Toronto and went to U of T for Teachers College. And after Teachers College, I was kind of in this space of like wanting to figure out how I could kind of integrate my passion for education with my simultaneous passion for creating safer spaces for queer and trans folks. It took me a really long time in my life to understand myself as queer, and even longer to understand myself as non-binary and genderqueer. And so the way I often describe that experience is that like if there's like a straight box for like a really long time, like I was kind of moving through the world with like my arm and leg sticking out, and everyone around me was like, straight, eh? And I was like, yeah. And everyone was like, maybe gay. And I was like, okay, now it's the opposite arm and leg. And so it took a really long time to get to a point where I was like, oh, queer, I am attracted to all kinds of humans. Indeed, there's space for that. And so I think for me, that really, really motivated me to want to do work in the world that would create a safer space for folks in all aspects of that rainbow people kind of space, to be able to have a more solid sense of ourselves and feel safer being whoever we are without kind of the pressure to fit into any kind of box. And so when I think about like my gender identity, that has taken me even longer because for a really long time I was like, yeah, woman, like that tracks for me. But the way in which I experience my womanhood like doesn't fit into this like colonial imposition of a strictly defined binary system. And I often joke that like my body made the decision for us, in that like my hormonal environment is such that I grow, as you can see, a gorgeous full goatee when I don't do anything about my facial hair. And so even though like woman is a pretty solid identity and matches up with like my assigned gender at birth, like ultimately that is not something that the world makes a lot of space for me to identify as and occupy space as. And so it's been really hard to come to a place where I could just be comfortable with my facial hair. And so that brings me back to my career trajectory, in that from Teachers College, I was very fortunate to be able to take up the work of creating safer spaces within school environments. So I started working at a national 2S LGBTQI inclusion not-for-profit with these lovely humans with whom I am here today. And that work looked like traveling around the province of Ontario, as well as across Canada, to talk with other educators about how to create safer spaces, both in like elementary and secondary settings, as well as in post-secondary settings. And from there, after experiencing some pretty hefty burnout and some not so great things, I shifted into being an independent practitioner. And luckily for me, not having to be completely alone in that, and getting to continue to collaborate with these people who I love so very, very much. And so in that work, I wear a lot of hats as I presently do it, both doing, as my colleagues here have spoken to, kind of generalized anti-racism and anti-oppression work, as well as continuing to get to do youth work. That's another kind of like branch of my career trajectory. I worked as the Hamilton Youth Arts Network coordinator briefly after my undergrad, and also have done some continued youth work in like summer program settings. And that's something I have some pretty passionate feelings about. And that coexists with my final hat that I'll speak to, which is focusing in on body liberation work. So as I said, I moved through the world in a fat body, and more so than my queerness or my non-binariness, like that has had a huge impact on my experience moving through the world. And the world is deeply fat phobic. And so I'm really honored to get to focus in on body liberation in this moment in my life, in providing support to other folks who are dealing with distressed and disordered eating, in order to support resistance and resilience to weight bias, stigma and discrimination, to toxic diet culture, and to having to exist in a fat phobic society. And especially so, I'll say, informed by my experience as well as a disabled person. So that's a little bit about me, kind of an all over the place way of describing myself. But certainly some of the things I want to highlight in that is just this idea of like what it means for a space to be accessible. Because I think often we get really focused on disability when we talk about accessibility. And I think that that is really important. And often there's lots of room for improvement when it comes to physical and emotional and mental disability, and the inclusion of all kinds of bodies and minds in spaces. But I also think that it's really important to take a mind to accessibility that also considers both gender, race, and body size, as well as other vectors of identity, because we might be doing a really great job in making a space accessible in one particular way, but if we don't take that intersectional approach, that's simply not going to result in what we want it to, which is a space where the full spectrum of human diversity is welcomed, and where the many humans that can help to create the best possible outcomes in the work that we do are going to be able to, as both Ronnie and Christine spoke to, be able to do that work in a way that is not like exploitative, isn't going to result in burnout, and isn't going to place like tons of round brackets emotional labor on the shoulders of folks already dealing with some pretty intense marginalization. So I'll end my chat there.
I just want to say that you, Suki Barbell, are in fact legendary in the work that you do. And I just want that to be known to the folks in the room. I have one thought, and then I just wanted to like highlight this thing about that you make so much safety, or you create so much space in the world for so many people and so many lived experiences. And I just wonder about, for all of us here, the four of us, that, we do this work for other people. It's very hard to do it for ourselves and for other people. And yeah, I just wanted to highlight that piece because it really spoke to me.
Oh, thanks so much, Ronnie. And I think that safety is something that is so paramount, right? But so hard to achieve, given that like we live in a world that is frankly a colonial nightmare, right? And there's so much disconnection from ourselves and from one another within that nightmare. And it's really, I think, so difficult to have a sense of what safety even means, given that so many of us have like never had access to it. And so I think like in relation to what you were sharing around being like a care professional, like often even when folks are accessing support from care professionals, and this is something I appreciate so much about your own work, often they're encouraged to like reclaim safety. And for so many of us, like it's not a reclamation, given that we've never actually had access to it. So thanks so much for so much for your love, and also for the opportunity to kind of put that out there too, because ultimately, like, safer spaces aren't something that many of us have had a chance to experience. So I'm going to conclude my own sharing there and throw the ball over to you at this point, Alex.
Thank you, Suki. We're looking at the clock and realizing that we got only a few minutes left in the conversation. We did want to make sure to have a chance to answer any questions that you folks had participating. We're really happy to have you here, and we're happy to engage if anyone's got anything that you particularly wanted to connect about. You're welcome to raise your hand or come off mute if you'd like to share something. You can also type it in the chat, and you'll see that I put a prompt in for questions in the chat. Anyone have anything that comes off the top?